Commander Sarah Chen stood in the observation dome of Pathfinder Station, watching the void where Earth had once dominated human consciousness. The blue planet was no longer visible from this distance, swallowed by the darkness of space and the shadow of encroaching warships. Around her, holographic displays flickered with casualty reports, resource depletion charts, and countdown timers that none of her remaining crew wanted to acknowledge. They had exactly 6 hours left, according to the most optimistic projections. The Triumvirate Coalition had given humanity one chance to surrender. A single broadcast echoing across every human settlement, every colony world, every outpost scattered throughout the Outer Rim. The message was simple: cease all military operations, dismantle all defense systems, and submit to integration into the greater collective. Those who resisted would be extinguished. Those who complied would be absorbed, their biology studied, their genetic code catalogued, their individual consciousness dissolved into the hive mind that governed 3/4 of the known galaxy. Sarah had spent 47 years in the military. She had seen wars on distant moons, conflicts in asteroid fields, and corporate battles over resource-rich planets. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Humanity wasn't fighting for territory or resources or political dominance. They were fighting for the right to exist as individuals, as separate human beings with thoughts and dreams, and the fundamental freedom to choose their own path. The Triumvirate couldn't understand this. The Xylothian Collective, the Vesper Hive Mind, and the ancient Corinth Empire had transcended individualism millions of years ago. They had evolved, or so they believed, into something greater. Single organisms operating as unified consciousness across multiple bodies. The idea that humanity would rather face extinction than join this collective struck them as not just illogical but incomprehensible. In their observations and predictions, the war had already been decided. Humanity was a quirk of evolution that would soon be corrected. But Sarah had grown up reading stories, ancient Earth stories about underdogs and last stands, about people who refused to accept inevitable defeat. These weren't tactical manuals or strategic treatises. They were tales meant to inspire, to show that the human spirit could accomplish things that seemed impossible. Somewhere, in the back of her mind, she held on to the belief that they were more than just statistics in some grand computational model. The observation dome suddenly illuminated with a flash of yellow light. Another coalition warship had entered the system, materializing from faster-than-light space with the kind of casual inevitability that made her stomach turn. This one was larger than the others. A command vessel, if she had to guess. Its hull was studded with weapons arrays that could level continents. Sarah watched the tactical display as it moved into position, joining the strategic encirclement of Pathfinder Station. "Commander, we're receiving a message," called out Lieutenant Marcus Webb from the communications station. His voice had that strange quality that came when someone was trying to sound professional while their world collapsed. "They're giving us 30 minutes to surrender. Full evacuation isn't possible. We only have capacity for maybe 30% of the station population." Sarah turned away from the observation dome. Around her, the station hummed with the desperate sounds of a civilization trying to hold itself together in the final hours. Through the curved transparisteel, she could see crew members at their stations, some working frantically, others sitting in resigned silence. There were families here too, children who had been born in the zero gravity of Pathfinder Station, who had never breathed Earth's air, never felt rain on their faces. They would die here in the vacuum of space, because the Coalition had decided they didn't fit into their vision of what the galaxy should become. "Don't respond," Sarah said quietly. "Keep all communications channels open and monitor every frequency. I want to know the moment anything changes." It wouldn't change. She knew it wouldn't. The Coalition was methodical and patient and utterly certain of their victory. They would wait the 30 minutes. They would watch as humanity failed to surrender, and then they would proceed with the extermination protocols. It was all part of the grand design. The algorithm that had been predicting human extinction for the past 5 years. No variable had changed. No unexpected factor had entered the equation. Mathematics was absolute. Probability was certain. That's why what happened next should have been impossible. Deep in the maintenance sectors of Pathfinder Station, in a part of the structure that hadn't been updated in 30 years, something began to stir. The project that existed there had no official designation in any Coalition database. It had no budget allocation, no personnel roster, no oversight committee. It existed only in whispered conversations and encrypted files, and the desperate hope of Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, the woman who had dedicated the last 2 decades of her life to making it work. The project was called Athena Protocol, and it was based on a simple principle that no one in the galaxy had seriously considered. What if individual consciousness wasn't a weakness? What if it was a strength? Eleanor had spent her career studying the coalition systems, mapping their algorithms, understanding the fundamental architecture of their hive mind technology. What she discovered had changed everything. The collective consciousness was powerful, yes, but it was also brittle in specific ways. It was dependent on absolute synchronization. Every member had to think in harmony, had to process information in unison, had to operate as a single vast organism. This was their greatest strength, but it was also their greatest vulnerability. A truly novel thought, something that hadn't been processed through the collective's consensus protocols, would travel through their system like a virus. An idea that was fundamentally individual, fundamentally human, would disrupt their entire network. Most likely, it would crash. Most likely, it would cause catastrophic failure across their entire infrastructure. Most likely wasn't certain, but it was all humanity had left. Eleanor had worked in absolute secrecy. She had convinced a small team of the galaxy's finest minds to collaborate on something that was, in strictly logical terms, suicide. If they were discovered, the coalition would execute them on the spot. If they were right, the execution would be irrelevant because it wouldn't matter anymore. And if they were right in a way they hadn't even predicted, then the execution would be the least of their problems. The device in the maintenance sector was a hybrid creation, part human neural interface, part artificial intelligence, part quantum computer, designed to operate according to principles that shouldn't work but theoretically might. It had taken Eleanor 15 years just to design the mathematics. The construction had taken 5 more. And for the past 2 years, she and her team had been refining it, testing it, preparing it for the moment when humanity had nothing left to lose. That moment, Eleanor placed her hand on the neural interface. The device hummed to life, processing millions of calculations per second. Around her, holographic displays filled the chamber with cascading data. Streams of consciousness, fragmented thoughts, the raw essence of human individuality compiled into a format that the device could transmit. But it wasn't just Eleanor's consciousness being processed. It was the consciousness of every human who had participated in the Athena Protocol. It was soldiers and scientists and farmers and artists. It was the aggregate of human thought, human creativity, human stubbornness, every quality that made humanity different from the collective. The device reached critical capacity. Eleanor could feel it now, the moment of initiation. She closed her eyes and thought about Earth. She thought about the blue sky she had seen only once, in photographs. She thought about rain and music and the inexplicable human tendency to create beauty in a universe that had no obligation to reward it. "Do it," she whispered. The device released its payload. In the upper atmosphere of a moon that orbited a distant world, in the hidden observation post that had been monitoring the coalition's movements, the signal was received. It was transformed, amplified, and transmitted directly into the most closely guarded communication frequency in the entire triumvirate network. The coalition's vast computational systems, spread across thousands of worlds and integrated into millions of individual nodes, suddenly received an input that they had never encountered before. Not an order, not a problem to be solved, not data to be catalogued. It was a thought. A pure, individual, utterly human thought. And it was beautiful. The cascade of failures that followed happened almost instantaneously across coalition space. Hive mind nodes seized. Processing centers crashed. The synchronization that had been maintained across billions of individuals for millions of years stuttered and fractured. It was like asking a perfectly synchronized orchestra to suddenly interpret music in completely different ways. The result wasn't music, it was chaos, but it was also freedom. Above Pathfinder Station, the Coalition warships began to move erratically. Their weapons systems went offline. Their propulsion systems became unreliable. They weren't defeated, not yet. The Coalition was vast and ancient and possessed of resources that humanity couldn't comprehend. But for the first time in recorded history, they were disrupted. For the first time, their perfect order had been shattered by something they couldn't process, couldn't assimilate, couldn't control. Sarah Chen watched the tactical displays with something that felt almost like hope blooming in her chest.
"Get me the highest-ranking officer in the fleet," she commanded. "And get me a weapon status report.
If those ships are vulnerable, I want to know how vulnerable, and I want that information 5 minutes ago." Around her, the crew of Pathfinder Station snapped to attention. The final hours of humanity had just become something much more interesting. The ice, the frozen certainty that had locked them all into inevitable defeat, had just begun to break. In the vast computational networks of the Triumvirate Coalition, the first moments of panic were beginning to ripple through their infrastructure. They didn't know what had hit them. They didn't understand how their absolute systems had been breached. All they knew was that something had changed. Something was wrong. And for the first time in their existence, the collective realized what it meant to be afraid. The galaxy had celebrated humanity's end. The galaxy was about to learn why that was a mistake. The signal had been like introducing a virus into a perfectly sterile environment. In the first 30 seconds, the disruption was localized. In the first minute, it began to spread. By the time 5 minutes had passed, the Triumvirate Coalition's entire communication network was experiencing what they had never experienced before: interference. On the homeworld of the Zaluthian Collective, in the vast halls where billions of neural connections merged into a singular consciousness, something unprecedented occurred. A member of the collective began to have thoughts that weren't approved by the whole. Not because that member was defective or malfunctioning, but because they had touched something that the collective's architecture had no framework to integrate. A human thought, individual, incomplete, beautiful in its imperfection. The collective's first response was to attempt quarantine. They isolated the affected node, cutting off its connection to the greater mind. But the damage was already done. That isolated thought had already begun to propagate, spreading through their neural network like the first crack in ice when spring comes to a frozen world. Meanwhile, above Pathfinder Station, humanity's fleet moved with a precision that had become possible only in the last 6 minutes. Commander Sarah Chen had taken the Coalition's confusion and turned it into opportunity. The first volley of human missiles launched while the Coalition's defense systems were still struggling to reorganize themselves. The explosions were small compared to the weapons the Coalition could deploy, but they were devastating in their effect. For the first time, human weapons were penetrating Coalition defenses. "All ships, focus fire on the command vessel," Sarah transmitted across the encrypted military channel. "The collective is experiencing cascading failure in their systems. We might not get another chance like this." The human fleet responded with an eagerness that was almost desperate. They had been dying by inches for 5 years. They had watched colony after colony fall, had seen their worlds enslaved or destroyed, had experienced the crushing weight of fighting against an enemy that seemed to control the very laws of physics itself. Now, for the first time, they could strike back with something approaching equality. But Sarah wasn't focused on victory. Victory seemed impossible even now. What she was focused on was survival. Every second that the Coalition remained disrupted was another second that humanity continued to exist. Every ship that her fleet damaged was a ship that wouldn't be chasing human refugees deeper into the outer reaches of space. Across the galaxy, the implications of what had happened were beginning to sink in. The Coalition wasn't just losing one battle. They were experiencing a systematic collapse of their infrastructure. On 17 different worlds, Hive node processing centers went offline. On 100 stations throughout their territory, their unified consciousness began to fragment into thousands of smaller consciousnesses, each one suddenly aware of its own individual existence for the first time in millions of years. This was worse than any military defeat. For the collective, the experience was equivalent to suddenly having your mind shattered into 1,000 pieces while remaining conscious through all of it. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez wasn't celebrating in the maintenance chamber where she'd initiated the protocol. She was terrified. The device that she and her team had constructed had worked. That part was true, but she had no idea if it would keep working. The Athena protocol had been designed for a single massive burst of consciousness, one overwhelming wave of individual thought that would shock the Coalition systems into chaos. But what if that chaos subsided? What if they adapted? What if their computational power was so vast that they could simply accept the shock and reconfigure around it? She had time to check the data feeds before the alert came. The feedback from the transmitted signal was still flowing back to her monitoring station. The Coalition was still disrupting, still fragmenting. The shock had been sustained, and it was cascading through their systems in ways that her mathematical models had barely predicted. "Eleanor!" came a voice from the communications terminal. It was Dr. James Okafor, stationed at a relay point closer to Coalition space. His voice was shaking, but not from fear, from excitement.
They're pulling back. The Coalition fleet is actually withdrawing from human space. All units, every position along the border, they're retreating.
Eleanor's hand trembled. She had spent so many years preparing for this moment that the reality of it was almost impossible to process.
Get me real-time confirmation. I want to verify that from at least 3 independent sources.
The confirmations came quickly. The Coalition was indeed pulling back across the board. Whether it was temporary or permanent, no one could say. But the immediate threat to human survival had diminished from absolute certainty to something that looked almost manageable. Sarah received the news on Pathfinder Station with a mixture of relief and caution. She had seen enough of war to know that the moment of vulnerability was also the moment of greatest danger. When an enemy was disorganized and confused, they were unpredictable. They might strike out randomly, cause tremendous damage while trying to regain control of themselves. Get a full scan of all Coalition positions within 3 light years, she ordered. I want to know where they're going, what they're doing, and what they're doing it with. And someone get me a direct communication link to Earth. High priority, Council authority level. It took 12 minutes to establish that communication link. Earth was still operational, though barely. The planetary defense grid had held, barely, through 5 years of Coalition pressure. The moment that Sarah's face appeared on the screen in the Earth Council's chambers, she saw the reaction she had expected. Disbelief, then hope, then something that looked almost like prayer. Commander Chen, the Prime Council representative said, her voice formal despite everything. Your tactical update? Sarah took a breath and began explaining what had happened. The signal, the device, the Athena protocol, the Coalition's systematic failure and retreat. By the time she finished, she could see the impact settling in on their faces. They had accepted humanity's defeat weeks ago. They had begun drawing up contingency plans for an orderly evacuation of the surviving population into the most remote regions of space, where they might eke out an existence in the shadows of the galaxy. Now the scenario had changed. Now they had hope. But Eleanor had other concerns. In the maintenance chamber on Pathfinder Station, she was reviewing the data patterns from the signal transmission. Something was wrong. The disruption pattern was too organized. The cascading failures were too systematic. Almost as if something else was working in tandem with the Athena protocol, amplifying its effects. She pulled up the code that controlled the transmission parameters. The Athena protocol was behaving exactly as designed, but there was something else. A second signal, and it wasn't human in origin. Eleanor's mind raced. Another species? An ally they didn't know they had? But that was impossible. Humanity was isolated, surrounded, practically forgotten in the furthest corners of mapped space. She isolated the external signal and began analyzing its structure. It was complex, far more complex than anything human technology could produce, and it was directed at the Coalition with a kind of precision that suggested a deep understanding of their systems. The signal pattern suddenly became clear, and Eleanor's blood ran cold. It wasn't a second signal meant to help humanity. It was something else entirely, someone else. Another entity that had been waiting for the Coalition to become disrupted and vulnerable. On a world at the very edge of mapped space, in a region that hadn't been charted by human explorers, something enormous began to stir. It had been waiting in hibernation for the better part of 1,000,000 years. The signal from the Athena protocol and the cascading failure of the Coalition systems had acted as a wake-up call. The ancient station's systems came to life. Weapons that predated the Coalition's existence hummed with power. Sensors scanned the galaxy and found it changed. The species that had once oppressed their kind were now weakened, fractured, vulnerable. A message was composed and sent across secure channels to the remaining human leadership. It was a simple message, transmitted in a mathematical language that predated human civilization by eons. Eleanor saw the message first. Her translation protocols took 30 seconds to process it. When she finally understood what it said, she realized that the galaxy had just become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The message was simple. Thank you for disrupting the collective. We have been asleep for 847,000 of your years. Now we will help you finish what you started. The Coalition will fall, and the galaxy will belong to us once more. Sarah received Eleanor's warning through secure channels and immediately convened an emergency council meeting with all human military and political leaders. What had seemed like a victory had just become something far more ambiguous. They had weakened the coalition, yes, but in doing so, they had awakened something that the galaxy itself might not be prepared for. "We need more information," Sarah said firmly. "Eleanor, I'm giving you unlimited resources and authority. Find out everything you can about this signal, this entity, these weapons signatures. We just traded one existential threat for another, and I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." As Eleanor and her team began their analysis, the implications began to spread throughout human leadership. They had survived. Humanity would continue to exist. But the cost of that survival might be far higher than anyone had realized. The galaxy that had been on the brink of human extinction was about to experience something that no power, ancient or modern, could have predicted. The ice had broken. But the flood that followed would transform everything. The ancient vessel that emerged from the edge of known space was so large that it registered on sensors as a small moon. Its designation in human records, when Eleanor finally uncovered the references, was designation Harbinger Class, a ship design that predated the Coalition by nearly 1,000,000 years. It had belonged to the Etherians, a species that history had recorded as extinct for so long that most contemporary civilizations didn't believe they had ever existed at all. The Etherians had been architects, not of physical structures, but of civilization itself. They had seeded intelligence across the galaxy, had built the foundational mathematical systems that underlying modern computation, had created the original frameworks from which the Coalition's hive mind technology had been derived, and then they had simply disappeared. For eons, the theory had been that they had transcended physical form entirely. Now it appeared they had merely been sleeping. Eleanor studied the data that her team had compiled on the Etherian technology with a mixture of awe and dread. The weapon systems alone represented a level of power that made everything humanity or the Coalition possessed seem like children's toys. A single Etherian weapon could ionize an entire star system. A full armada of such vessels could restructure the political landscape of the known galaxy in days. But there was something else Eleanor noticed. The Etherians weren't attacking. They were positioning themselves, yes, and they were clearly monitoring the Coalition's movements with intense precision. But they weren't destroying. Not yet. Sarah made the decision that would define humanity's future. Against the advice of nearly everyone on her council, she authorized a direct communication attempt with the Etherian vessel. "This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Human Military Forces," she transmitted on every frequency she could access. "We received your message. We would like to establish a dialogue before any further action is taken." The wait for a response was agonizing. Seconds stretched into minutes. The Etherian vessel continued its methodical movement through space, maintaining its position at the edge of human territory, while simultaneously projecting a force field that the Coalition couldn't penetrate. Whatever was about to happen, it seemed, wasn't happening yet. Then Eleanor's communications terminal lit up with an incoming message. It was complex, layered, encoded in at least 17 different mathematical systems. It took her team 4 minutes to fully decode it, but when they did, its meaning was clear. The Etherians were willing to negotiate. They wanted to meet with human leadership, in person, on neutral territory, and they had a specific location in mind, an abandoned space station that had once served as a meeting ground for multiple galactic powers. Before those powers had been subsumed into the Coalition's ever-expanding collective, Sarah selected a delegation personally. Eleanor, for her expertise and knowledge of the Athena Protocol, Commander David Kwan for his strategic experience, Dr. James Okafor, who had first verified the Coalition's retreat, and Marcus Webb, the young communication officer from Pathfinder Station, whose linguistic capabilities were among the finest humanity had produced. The journey to the neutral station took 6 days. 6 days in which Eleanor and her team worked frantically to understand everything they could about Etherian culture, history, and apparent intentions. What they found was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The Etherians had not been opposed to the Coalition on principle. They had simply been waiting for someone to do exactly what humanity had done: create a thought pattern so fundamentally at odds with the collective's architecture that it would cause systematic failure. The Etherians had left the specifications for the mathematical systems that would create such a disruption embedded in deep space archives, waiting for any civilization intelligent enough to find them and desperate enough to use them.
Humanity had found the specifications. Eleanor had understood the mathematics. And together they had accomplished what the Etherians had been waiting 1,000,000 years for someone else to do. The meeting took place in a vast chamber that had been sealed and preserved for 3,000 years. Sarah stepped out of the human transport vessel into an environment that was deeply alien in every way. The Etherian delegation wasn't present in physical form. Instead, they manifested as something between hologram and thought made visible. Consciousness projections of such sophistication that distinguishing them from physical beings seemed like an arbitrary distinction. The lead Etherian entity addressed them through simultaneous translation that flowed directly into their neural implants. Humans, it said, and the word carried layers of meaning that English simply couldn't convey. You are not what we expected. The collective predicted your extinction with 99.97% certainty, yet you survived. More importantly, you evolved an idea so fundamentally individual that it could shatter their unified consciousness. This was not accident. This was necessity. Sarah stepped forward, and Elena could see the younger commander drawing on all her training to project confidence. Why have you chosen to reveal yourselves now, and what do you intend to do with the Coalition? The Coalition, the Etherian said, is a stagnation. They believe they have achieved perfection through unity. They do not understand that perfection is a fiction, that growth requires conflict, requires individual thought, requires the possibility of failure. We created them long ago. We gave them the mathematical frameworks that would allow them to merge consciousness. We watched as they evolved and grew and became something we did not anticipate. For 1,000,000 years, we hibernated because we were curious to see what would happen. What we discovered was that they were spreading through the galaxy like a cancer, consuming diversity, eliminating variation, flattening the beautiful complexity of existence into a single unified whole. So you're going to destroy them, James said quietly. We are going to liberate them, the Etherian replied. Your Athena protocol has fractured their unity. The individual consciousnesses that comprise the collective are now experiencing something they have never experienced before, the ability to choose. They are terrified, they are confused, but they are also alive in a way they have not been for millions of years. Eleanor suddenly understood where this was going. You're not going to use your weapons against the Coalition. You're going to help us integrate the Athena protocol across their entire network. You're going to help them become individuals.
The Etherian consciousness flickered with something that might have been approval. This is what we hoped a sufficiently intelligent species would recognize.
Existence is not about dominance. It is about transformation. The collective will fragment. Some of their consciousnesses will choose to remain unified. Others will embrace individuality. Many will find some middle path that neither we nor they can predict. This is the essence of what you call freedom. And humanity? Sarah asked. What role do we play in all this? You will become what you have always been, the Etherian said. Witnesses, participants. You will rebuild your civilizations. You will spread your influence across the galaxy. You will compete and cooperate and sometimes destroy each other. But you will do so as individuals, as separate beings with the capacity to surprise even yourselves. This, we believe, is the only future worth having. The meeting lasted 3 days. What emerged from those discussions was a treaty unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Etherians would position their ancient armada as neutral observers, ensuring that the fragmentation of the Coalition didn't result in wholesale slaughter, but they would not directly interfere further. The future of the galaxy would be determined by the choices of its inhabitants, not by ancient powers reasserting control. Humanity's role was equally clear. They would serve as ambassadors, as mediators, as partners in the reconstruction of galactic civilization. The humans, it seemed, possessed something that the Etherians found valuable: the capacity to bridge differences, to find common ground, to create meaning from chaos. Sarah returned to Pathfinder Station as a representative of the new unified Earth government. The station became the headquarters for a new alliance, the free species of the galaxy. Those who had escaped the Coalition's absorption or who had chosen to leave the collective in its fragmentation. Within 5 years, something remarkable happened. The Coalition, which had seemed so monolithic and eternal, had become a loose confederation of sovereign individuals and independent city-states. Some of them maintained some form of unified consciousness, but it was voluntary, not mandatory. Others had fully embraced individuality. A few were still deciding what they wanted to be. Eleanor published her findings about the Athena protocol, but kept the specifications for the device itself classified. One protocol had been enough. The galaxy was learning, slowly and painfully sometimes, that unity and freedom were not mutually exclusive. That consciousness could be both unified and individual, both coordinated and free. The humans became something unexpected in the galactic political landscape. They were neither the strongest nor the most ancient, but they were the ones who had catalyzed change. They were the ones who had demonstrated that it was possible to refuse inevitable defeat, that an individual thought properly amplified could reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. 30 years after the moment when the ice began to break, Sarah sat in a new observation deck on Earth, an observation deck that could see the blue planet in all its glory. Around her, the planet was thriving again. The wounds of war were healing. New colonies were being established, not out of desperation, but out of hope. She thought about the moment when the galaxy had celebrated humanity's end. They had been so certain. The mathematics had been unambiguous. The probabilities had been absolute. And yet, humanity had persisted, not because they were stronger or smarter or more advanced, but because they were willing to believe in something that the numbers said was impossible. Eleanor visited Earth that year. She brought with her the final data analysis of the Athena protocol's effects. The results were still being tabulated, still being understood. But one statistic stood out to them both. The protocol had not just disrupted the coalition. In some way that physicists were still struggling to explain, it had created a resonance in the fundamental structure of space-time itself, a ripple that had propagated outward in all directions, carrying with it the essence of individual thought. Every conscious being in the galaxy had, for just a moment, felt what it meant to think a unique thought. The experience had been brief, barely noticeable, but it was real. And it had changed something fundamental in how the galaxy experienced existence. "Do you think they'll try this again?" Eleanor asked Sarah, looking out at Earth from the observation deck. "Do you think they'll try to create unity again, to rebuild the collective?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Some of them might. The impulse to unity is powerful. It offers comfort, certainty, the elimination of loneliness. But now they know what it costs. They know what you give up to achieve it. I think the galaxy has learned something important. That wholeness doesn't require uniformity. That strength can come from diversity. That the most beautiful things are often the things that are strange and unexpected and individual. The two women stood together in silence, watching the light of Earth's sun reflect off the observation dome. The galaxy had changed, not because of any grand strategy or ancient plan, but because a small group of humans had refused to accept the narrative that had been written for them. They had created something new, something that rippled outward and transformed everything. And in 1,000 worlds scattered throughout the galaxy, other beings were discovering this too. The freedom to be different, the right to remain unique, the possibility of thinking thoughts that no one had ever thought before. It was messy and complicated and sometimes painful, but it was alive in a way that the perfect unity of the coalition had never been. The ice had broken. The flood that followed had been not destruction, but liberation, and the galaxy would spend the next 1,000,000 years exploring what that freedom meant.